Welcome to This Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. I'm Amanda Jones, filling in for Vice-Chancellor Professor Stephen Parker. Good morning, Michelle.
Hi, Amanda.
A busy week for the government with some successes from its point of view. How do you think they'll be feeling as they now go into this 3-week recess?
I think they'll be feeling pretty pleased and relieved. They've found a way around Senate obstruction on their fuel indexation measure. Now that has to be validated later by the Parliament, but it'll be up and running from November. They've done a deal with Clive Palmer on direct action. In return, they've had to agree to an inquiry into emissions trading, which could hold some problems for the future because the government says that under no circumstances will it have an ETS, but nevertheless it's got direct action going, and that's an election promise, and also very importantly a climate policy, because there was a vacuum after the carbon tax was repealed. And they've also got another tranche of the security legislation, and again that is something they regard as a priority. So many budget measures are still outstanding, or key budget measures, but nevertheless progress has been made on several fronts.
Bill Shorten has been accommodating to the government on national security, but you say that some of his colleagues are beginning to arc up on it. Could that just be a few of them positioning themselves for later use, or is there a risk of a serious revolt?
I think that the left is unhappy about the fact that the national security measures are in some cases quite draconian, and that Labor has been pretty accommodating. Now, some changes were secured during the parliamentary process when the legislation, and there have been 2 tranches now, went to a committee, but nevertheless Bill Shorten has been determined to be as bipartisan as possible. I don't think there's going to be an open revolt. There are statements from people from time to time, but basically the caucus remains in line. But what is interesting, I think, is whether there's pressure on the 3rd tranche, which is for the retention of metadata, and whether Labor then demands more concessions from the government than it has on earlier parts of the security legislation. It's hard to know, but metadata is something that raises a lot of concerns in the community, more than some of these earlier measures.
Now, Joe Hockey made a song and dance about he had berated a local mayor when council regulations stopped him from joining 2 outside tables together at a pizza restaurant. Now, if you're in charge of Joe's PR, what advice would you give him?
If I was in charge of Joe's PR, I might be starting to look for another job, because it's a really hard job managing Joe at the moment. His political fortunes have really dropped incredibly if you think of a year ago, as he was setting out in his very early days as Treasurer. The pizza shop story, incidentally, he told in the context of talking about deregulation, how we're over-regulated, and it did relate to some years ago, but it just seemed a very odd story to tell, because what he was saying was he'd had a total meltdown and carried it to the point of finding the local mayor on a Friday night, which is, it's a bit like Bill Shorten's moment in the pie shop. It really is not something you'd want to remember, you would think. But more generally, of course, Joe has serious political problems at the moment. The budget wasn't sold well, it wasn't really framed well, it had just too many measures that upset too many people, and I think that he has a difficult year of consolidation ahead. He's also been recently defeated over the question of whether Australia joins a new bank that China is setting up in the region. Now, this was a quite interesting struggle between the Treasury, Joe Hockey, Andrew Robb on the one hand, and Julie Bishop, the Foreign Minister, on the other, and Julie Bishop has won the argument. The Americans were very against Australia joining this bank. We're not going to do so at the moment. Tony Abbott has taken the side of of Julie Bishop. So foreign affairs has won over economic affairs, if you like, and it's been another setback for Joe Hockey.
Finally, Ian Watt is retiring as Head of Prime Minister's Department, giving the PM a further chance to reshape the leadership of the public service. With new heads of the Prime Minister's Department and Treasury, how will it actually help the government's agenda?
What the government has done in these appointments, and we expect John Fraser, a former Treasury officer now in the private sector, to be appointed to Treasury, what it's done is really get people in that it is comfortable with. Michael Thorley was an advisor to John Howard on international relations. He was also our ambassador in Washington during some of the Howard years. So I think that it will feel that it does have people that it relates to better than it has with the existing permanent heads. But nevertheless, these two people have been out of government service for quite a long time. They've been overseas, working overseas. They've been working in the financial world. As someone put it to me, they've not been in jobs where you have to feed the beast every day, perhaps every hour, the beast being both the politicians and the media indirectly, because the politicians are trying to feed the media. They're going into huge jobs and they're going to have to adapt very quickly to those jobs.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and Professor Parker will be back next week.